There is a cup of coffee cooling on a table. The surface is almost black. A thin ring of oil floats at the edge, catching the light. Steam bends slowly in the air above it. Everything in that cup began as a seed inside a small red fruit, on a shrub growing wild in the shade of a highland forest in southwestern Ethiopia. Long before anyone thought to drink it. It was guarded, stolen, smuggled, and fought over for centuries to reach you. This will take about 2 hours, told in order, from the beginning. You are not expected to stay awake for the end. If you drift off in a monastery in Yemen and wake in a coffeehouse in London, nothing has been lost. So let the cup go cold beside you. It begins in a forest. Begin with the forest, because the forest was there first. If you could stand in the southwestern highlands of Ethiopia before any of this happened, before the ships and the ports and the enormous sums of money, you would find yourself somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 meters above the sea, in a place where the clouds do not sit politely overhead but drift through the trees at eye level. The air is cool and damp and smells of wet bark. The canopy above you is high and almost unbroken, and the light that reaches the ground has been cut into pieces by all those leaves. So it arrives in shifting patches that move whenever the branches move. Down in that broken light, in the layer botanists call the understory, grows a shrub with dark, glossy leaves. It is not a large plant, and it does not compete for the sky. It has spent its entire evolutionary existence underneath something taller than itself, and every part of it has been shaped by that fact. Its leaves are broad and thin, because broad, thin leaves are good at catching scattered light. It has no defense against hard, direct sun. It has no defense at all against frost. It expects the rain to arrive and then stop, and then arrive again in a rhythm it has learned over an unimaginable number of seasons. And if that rhythm breaks, the plant sulks and gives you nothing. Hold on to that, because it matters more than almost anything else here. This is a shade plant, a quiet, sheltered, fussy, forest floor plant. And nearly every human being who ever tried to grow it at scale, on hillsides in Java and in Martinique and in the valleys of Brazil, began by cutting down the trees that were shading it and standing it out in the open sun in long, straight rows. For 4 centuries, the coffee industry was essentially an argument with the plant's own nature, and the plant has never entirely stopped arguing back. When the rains come, the shrub flowers. This is the part almost nobody outside the growing regions has seen. The blossoms open white and small and clustered tight along the branches, and they smell of jasmine, sweet and heavy, strong enough that on a still morning you can smell a hillside of them before you can see it. They last a few days. Then they fall, and where each flower was, a small hard green fruit begins to form. It takes months. The fruit swells, turns from green to a dull yellow, then to orange, and finally to a deep, glossy red. People call them cherries, though they are nothing like cherries and are not related to them in any way. Cut one open, and you find a thin layer of flesh that is genuinely sweet, sticky, faintly like honeydew melon, and beneath that a papery skin. And inside that, 2 seeds lying with their flat faces pressed together like a pair of hands closed in prayer. Those seeds are the entire point. Everything else in this story, every fortune and every war and every empire, is about 2 small seeds inside a fruit that almost nobody drinking coffee today has ever tasted. So the plant was there. How long it took anyone to notice, we do not know. What we can say is that the highlands of southwestern Ethiopia were not empty. Long before any of this became a trade or an industry or a habit, People were living in those forests and using that shrub, the oromo among them, and the communities in the region called Kaffa, whose name is close enough to the word coffee that scholars still argue about which came first. They knew the plant. They used it. They simply did not use it the way you use it. They ate it. Ripe cherries were picked, crushed, and worked together with animal fat, then rolled into balls roughly the size of a fist and carried on long journeys. It was food and stimulant in one object, the world's first energy bar by a margin of about 2,000 years. The leaves were chewed. The leaves were also steeped in hot water to make a thin, pale tea, a practice that survives in parts of Ethiopia and South Sudan to this day and tastes almost nothing like the drink you know. The plant was useful to human beings for a very long time before anybody thought of doing the one thing that would change the world with it. And that one thing, the thing that had to be discovered, was fire. Which brings us to a goat herd, and to the most famous story in the history of coffee, which is almost certainly not true, and which we are going to tell anyway. The story goes like this. Somewhere around the 9th century, in the hills near Kaffa, there was a young goat herd named Kaldi. One evening his flock did not settle. They were bleating, butting heads, springing around on the slope with an energy that made no sense for animals at the end of a long day. Kaldi watched them and noticed they had been grazing on a bush covered in small red berries. So he did what any curious person alone on a hillside would do. He ate some himself, and the tiredness went out of him like water out of a cracked jar. He carried the berries down to a monastery, and here the story turns. An elder monk took one look at them, declared them the work of the devil, and threw the whole handful into the fire. And then the smell came up out of the coals, rich and dark and utterly unlike anything in that room, and it drifted out through the doorway and across the courtyard. And the other monks came running to find out what was burning. They raked the blackened beans out of the ashes, crushed them, poured hot water over the grounds, and drank what came out. That night, the whole community stayed awake through the entire night office without a single head nodding. It is a wonderful story. It is also, as far as anyone can tell, fiction. It does not appear anywhere in writing until around the year 1671, when a Roman scholar named Antoine Faustus Nyron set it down in a treatise on coffee, some 800 years after it supposedly happened. Nobody in Ethiopia was telling it in the 9th century, because there is no record of anybody telling it at all until Europe wanted an origin story and found one. But hold on to what the story is actually about, because underneath the goats there is something real. Somebody, at some point, in some place we will never identify, took a seed that is bitter and pale and tastes of almost nothing and put it into a fire. That person is the actual discoverer. We do not know their name. We never will, because the fire is the whole invention. A raw green coffee seed smells like hay and dried grass. Chew one, and you get bitterness and something vaguely vegetal, and nothing that would make you want a second. There is no coffee in coffee until it is roasted. What heat does inside that seed is closer to alchemy than cooking. Sugars caramelize. Sugars and amino acids collide and rebuild themselves into entirely new compounds that did not exist a minute earlier. Water boils off. Pressure builds inside the bean until it swells and cracks open with an audible pop that roasters listen for the way a doctor listens to a chest. By the time it is finished, more than 800 distinct aromatic compounds have appeared inside a seed that contained almost none of them. That is why the smell carries so far, and why it is so difficult to describe, and why it made monks run across a courtyard in a story that probably never happened. Whoever first understood that, the way they drank it survives. And it is being practiced in Ethiopia this morning while you listen to this. It is called buna, which is simply the Amharic word for coffee. And it is not a recipe. It is closer to an invitation. Green beans are roasted in the room where the guests are sitting, in a shallow pan over a small flame, stirred constantly. And when they darken, the pan is carried around so that everyone present can lean into the smoke and breathe it. The beans are then ground by hand in a heavy wooden mortar, the pestle striking with a rhythm you can hear from the street. Water is boiled in a round-bellied clay pot called a jebena. The grounds go in, and the pot sits on the coals until it rises. Grass is often scattered on the floor. Incense burns in the corner. Then it is poured, and poured again, and poured a third time. 3 rounds, each one weaker than the last, and each one with a name. The first is a bowl. The second is tona. The third is baraka, and baraka means blessing. You do not leave after the first cup. Leaving after the first cup is the equivalent of walking out of a house halfway through dinner. The whole thing takes an hour, sometimes 2, and the duration is not an inconvenience. It is the entire purpose. In everyday Amharic, the phrase buna tetu means, literally, drink coffee. What it actually means, when a neighbor says it to you across a fence, is come and sit with me, and let us talk until there is nothing left to say. So the first room that coffee ever built was a room in Ethiopia, with grass on the floor and smoke in the air and no hurry in it at all. That room is still standing. It is still full. But a room is a small thing, and the plant was about to get much larger ambitions. Because on the far side of a narrow strip of water, barely wider than a good day's sail, there were mountains that looked a great deal like these mountains, and there were people there who were about to take this shrub out of the forest, plant it in rows on stone terraces, and turn it into the first great monopoly of the modern world. Look at a map of the Red Sea and follow it south, down past the deserts on either side, until the 2 coasts begin to lean towards each other. At the bottom, where the sea empties into the Gulf of Aden, the gap closes to something under 30 kilometers. On a clear day, you can stand on one shore and see the land on the other. Arab geographers called that strait the Gate of Tears, and for thousands of years it was less a barrier than a doorway, worn smooth by traffic going both directions. Somewhere in that traffic, coffee crossed. We do not know when. We do not know who carried it. This is one of those places in history where the honest answer is a shrug, and it is better to say so plainly than to invent a name and a date to fill the silence. It may have travelled with merchants running the incense and ivory routes. It may have gone with pilgrims. Since the Horn of Africa had been sending Muslims across that water towards Mecca for centuries, and it may well have travelled with enslaved people, taken out of the Ethiopian highlands and sold into Arabia, carrying in their hands or in their heads the knowledge of a plant from home. That last possibility is rarely mentioned in the cheerful version of this story, and it deserves to be. What we can say is this: when the written record of coffee finally begins, properly, in documents that survive and can be checked, it does not begin in Ethiopia. It begins across the water, in the mountains of Yemen, in the 15th century, and it begins not in a market and not in a palace, but in the prayer rooms of men who had given up almost everything they owned. They were Sufis, members of the mystical orders of Islam, and their practice revolved around something called dhikr, which means remembrance. In its simplest form, dhikr is the repetition of the names of God. In practice, it could last most of a night. A small group of men in a low room, sitting on mats, sometimes swaying, sometimes breathing in a controlled rhythm, repeating a single phrase hundreds and hundreds of times until the words stopped being words and became something closer to a pulse. The aim was not to think. The aim was to arrive somewhere thought could not reach. The obstacle was the body. You cannot sustain that kind of attention for 6 hours in the middle of the night when you have worked all day and eaten a plain meal at sunset. Heads drop. Concentration fray. Whole circles come apart at 2 in the morning for no reason more mystical than exhaustion. So a pot went round the room. The picture is worth holding for a moment, because it is where everything you know about coffee actually starts. A room lit by one lamp. Mats on the floor. A clay pot passed hand to hand around a circle, each man taking a swallow and giving it to the next. And the taste of it dark and unfamiliar, and probably closer to a bitter medicinal broth than to anything you would order today. Nobody in that room is relaxing. Nobody is chatting. Nobody is doing business. There is no sugar in it and no milk. And the suggestion of either would have seemed absurd. They are drinking it because it holds the door of the mind open a few hours longer than the body would allow. They called it kahwa, and the choice of that word was not innocent. Kahwa was an old Arabic term, and one of the things it had long meant was wine. It also carried a sense of something that dulls the appetite, that takes away your desire for food. To lift that word and fasten it onto a lawful drink was to make a quiet argument in public, here is our wine, and there is nothing forbidden in it. That argument would be picked apart by jurists for the next 200 years. But the name stuck. And it is still with us. Kahwa became kav in Turkish, and kav became cafe in Italian, and café became coffee. Every time you say the word, you are repeating a 15th century legal defense. Word traveled from the prayer circles outward, the way these things do. First to the students and scholars who kept the same late hours, then to the merchants, then to anyone in the city of Aden or the city of Zabid who had heard that there was a drink that made the night longer, and once a whole region wants a thing every single day. It stops being a curiosity and becomes agriculture. This is the moment Yemen changes the story, because Ethiopia had coffee, and had it in abundance, and gathered it largely from the forest as it grew. Yemen did something no one had done before. Yemen farmed it on purpose. Go and look at what that meant. The highlands behind the Red Sea coast are dry, steep, and stony, with rain that falls in short, violent bursts and then does not come again for months. Nothing about that country wants to grow a shade-loving forest shrub. So the Yemenis built the country the plant needed. They cut terraces into the mountainsides, stacked walls of dry stone by hand, one on top of another, level after level, and packed soil in behind them until a vertical slope became a staircase of small, flat fields. Some of those walls are the height of a man. Some of those hillsides carry 40 or 50 terraces stacked from the valley floor to the ridge. Then came the water. Rain that fell on the bare upper slopes was caught, channeled into cisterns and stone gutters, and released down through the terraces in a sequence, so that a single storm could be spent slowly over weeks rather than lost in an afternoon. Shade trees were planted above the coffee to give it the canopy it had lost. Whole villages in the Haraz Mountains and the hills around Sana'a were organized around maintaining this system. Because a terrace wall that collapses in one season takes the soil of 30 years down the mountain with it. In some villages, the same families have been repairing the same walls for 20 generations. It is among the most demanding agriculture human beings have ever attempted, and it was done with hand tools and stone. and for roughly 200 years, effectively every coffee bean traded anywhere on the face of the earth came off those walls. All of it flowed downhill to one place. On the Red Sea coast sat a port called Al-Makah, a hot, flat, whitewashed town with a shallow harbour. And by the 16th century, it had become the neck of a funnel through which the world's coffee had to pass. Camel caravans came down out of the mountains. Warehouses filled. Ships from Egypt loaded for Cairo and Alexandria. And from there the beans went on to Damascus and Istanbul. Merchants came from Persia and India. Later, the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company built trading houses there, waiting on the monsoon winds that governed when anyone could sail and when everyone simply sat. In the dead season the harbour emptied and the town waited, because nothing moves against that wind. That town gave its name to the cargo. The word travelled outward with the sacks, got bent by every language it passed through, and settled in the end as Mocha. It has been attached to coffee ever since, so firmly that 400 years later people order it by that name in cafes in cities that did not exist when the ships were loading, almost none of them aware that they are naming a small Yemeni harbour on the edge of a desert. And Yemen understood exactly what it was holding. Here is the thing about a coffee bean. It is not a bean. It is a seed, which means that every sack leaving that harbour was, in principle, a plantation waiting to happen somewhere else. Anyone who could get fertile seed and a suitable climate could break the whole arrangement in a generation. So the seed was killed before it left. Beans were boiled, or parched, or roasted just enough to make sure that nothing in the sack could ever germinate. What went out to the world was a drink and never a crop. On top of that, foreigners were kept firmly away from the growing regions in the mountains. You could trade at the coast. You did not go up into the hills. Merchants who arrived hoping to see a living plant found the mountains politely and permanently closed to them. It was one of the earliest deliberate agricultural monopolies anywhere in recorded commerce. And it was elegant. And it was ruthless. And for about 200 years it worked exactly as intended. Wealth poured into Yemen. The terraces spread further up the slopes. The pot went on being passed hand to hand in prayer rooms, and now also in the first coffee houses, while the rest of the world paid whatever was asked. But a monopoly built on a living seed has a flaw at the center of it, and the flaw is that seeds are small. They fit in a pocket. They fit inside a hollowed-out walking staff, or a bag of dates, or the folds of a robe, or a beard. Sooner or later, a plant that thousands of people handle every day is going to walk out of the country in somebody's clothing. And no amount of boiling at the port will change that. For 2 centuries, the plant stayed where it was put. It would not stay much longer, and the first men to carry it out were not thieves in the ordinary sense at all. One of them was a pilgrim on his way home from Mecca, who believed that what he was doing was an act of devotion rather than a crime. Coffee moved north out of Yemen the way water moves, which is to say, it found every available channel at once. Up the pilgrim roads, along the caravan tracks into Egypt and Syria, into Mecca, which was not simply a holy city, but the busiest crossroads in the Muslim world, a place through which people from 3 continents passed every year, taking home whatever they had encountered. And in Mecca, in the year 1511, coffee ran into the first man who decided to stop it. His name was Khair Beg, and he was the governor of the city, appointed from Cairo. The version of the story most often told has him walking past a mosque late one night and finding a group of men drinking something dark in the lamplight, and recognizing, correctly, that they had been talking about him. Whether or not that night happened, his objection had 2 parts, and he was careful not to separate them in public. The stated objection was legal. Coffee, he argued, was an intoxicant. It altered the mind. Alcohol was forbidden. And if this drink did something similar to a man's judgment, then this drink was forbidden too. To make the case properly, he did what a careful administrator does. He convened a council of jurists and physicians and put the question to them formally, with the beans laid out on a table in front of them like evidence at a trial. Two Persian brothers, who served as the city's doctors, testified that the drink was harmful to the body. The council agreed. The ruling came down. The cellars were shut. The stocks were carried out into the street and burned. And men caught drinking were beaten. The unstated objection was simpler and closer to the truth. Men who sit up half the night together talk. And what they talk about, sooner or later, is the man who governs them. It did not last. Word travelled back to Cairo, where the Sultan's court took a very different view, not least because Cairo was enjoying the drink itself. The ruling was overturned from above. The cellars reopened. And within a few years Kher Beg had lost his post and, according to some accounts, ended rather badly. The pattern that would repeat for the next 200 years was established on the very first attempt, and it never varied much. The ban is loud. The ban is short. The official goes. The drink stays. Because by then, coffee was no longer only a drink. It had begun to build something around itself, and that something was about to arrive in the largest city in Europe. The Ottoman Empire in the 16th century was at the height of its reach, reaching from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, and its capital sat on the water between two continents. In the year 1554, in a crowded commercial quarter of Istanbul called Tahtakale, two Syrian merchants opened a shop. One had come from Aleppo, one from Damascus. History remembers them, thinly, as Hakam and Shams. What they opened is generally credited as the first coffee house in the city, and possibly the first true coffee house anywhere. Picture the room, because the room is the invention. Low wooden benches running along the walls, cushions on them, carpets on the floor, a fire and a row of small long-handled pots, backgammon boards, chess, a man in the corner reciting poetry, or working his way through a story that he will not finish tonight because he intends you to come back tomorrow. Later. Once tobacco arrives from the Americas, a permanent blue haze of pipe smoke hanging under the ceiling. And on those benches, men. Here is what made it new. Before this, a man in a city like Istanbul had three places to be. He had his home. He had his work. He had his mosque. Each of those places came with a fixed role attached, and a fixed set of things, you could say. The coffee house was none of the three. It cost almost nothing to enter. It had no membership and no ritual. A porter could sit within arm's reach of a minor official, and a poet and a merchant just back from Persia. And while they were on that bench, the differences between them thinned out considerably. It was, in a real sense, the first public living room. It spread like fire in dry grass. Within a generation, the Cavahane was everywhere. Istanbul, Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo. Estimates from the reign of Murad III put the number of coffee houses in Istanbul in the hundreds, with some accounts running past 600, in a city that had perhaps 500,000 people in it. Neighborhoods began to be identified by their coffee house the way an English village is identified by its pub. Now do the arithmetic that kept the palace awake. 600 rooms. Rooms with no guild rules and no clergy and no owner of consequence. Rooms open at night. Rooms in which ordinary men who could not read, and men who could, sat in the same place and heard the same news, and formed opinions about the price of bread, the conduct of the war, and the character of the Sultan. The Ottoman state did not have a police force in any sense you would recognize. What it had was a very good sense of when a city was talking. And so, once again, a ruler tried to close them. Murad IV came to the throne as a child and grew into one of the hardest men ever to hold that office. He had watched an uncle deposed and murdered. He had seen the army mutiny. And he governed with the settled conviction that the state was one bad night away from coming apart. Around the year 1633, following a catastrophic fire in Istanbul, he banned coffee and tobacco together and ordered the coffeehouses closed across the empire. He did not close them gently. The accounts, some certainly embellished by later writers, describe him going out into the city at night in ordinary clothes, alone or nearly so, to see for himself who was disobeying him, and dealing with what he found on the spot. Some of the coffeehouses were pulled down, some were walled up. Set aside the theatre of it and look at the plain fact underneath. The ruler of one of the largest empires on the face of the earth, a man commanding armies that could threaten Vienna, considered a drink and the rooms it was served in to be a genuine danger to his throne. Nobody bans something that does not matter. The severity of the crackdown is the best evidence we have of how much power those low benches had quietly accumulated. And it failed, the way all of them failed. Murad IV died young. The ban went with him. The shutters came off. The little pots went back on the fires. And the coffeehouses of Istanbul reopened and then stayed open, more or less continuously, for the next 400 years, through the collapse of the empire itself and out the other side into a republic. What survived with them was a specific way of making the drink that has barely changed. The beans ground finer than anything else in the world of coffee, closer to dust than to powder. Cold water, the coffee, and the sugar, if you want it, all put together at the start in a small pot with a long handle, brought slowly up until a dark foam rises, taken off before it boils over, then returned once or twice, poured grounds and all into a small cup, and left to settle for a minute before anyone touches it. You drink 2/3 of it and you leave the sludge at the bottom. And then, if the company is right, someone turns the cup over on the saucer and reads the patterns the grounds have made. That method is now formally recognized as a piece of the world's intangible cultural heritage, which is a very modern way of saying that a room built by 2 Syrian merchants in 1554 is still standing. You cannot ban a room. That is the lesson every one of these men learned, and none of them wrote down. Shut it, and the people who were in it simply build it again a street away, or in a cellar, or in another country entirely. And while Istanbul was arguing with itself about whether these places should exist at all, merchants from a small, damp, quarrelsome set of city-states on the far side of the Mediterranean were sitting on those very benches, drinking from those very cups, and beginning to wonder what would happen if they took the idea home. Of all the cities in Europe, Venice was always going to be the first. Venice was not really a European city in the way Paris or Madrid were European cities. Venice was a hinge. It sat on a lagoon at the top of the Adriatic with its back to the continent and its face turned east. And it had spent 5 centuries growing rich by being the place where the goods of the Ottoman world were unloaded and sold on to everybody else. Venetian merchants had trading houses in Istanbul and Aleppo and Alexandria. They spoke the languages. They sat, quite literally, on the benches we have just been describing, drinking from small cups in rooms full of pipe smoke. And then they went home, So coffee arrived in Venice sometime in the second half of the 16th century, in small quantities, as one more strange Eastern commodity among the pepper and the silk and the indigo. And here is the part people forget. It did not arrive as a pleasure. It arrived as a drug. The first Venetians to sell it were not running cafes. They were street vendors with trays hung round their necks, and apothecaries, the chemists of their day, who kept it on a shelf alongside dried herbs, powdered minerals and bottles of lemonade. It was recommended for sluggish digestion, for melancholy, for the after effects of a heavy night. It was expensive, faintly disreputable, and mostly bought by people who thought they were medicating themselves. It took decades for that to change. Coffee moved off the apothecary's shelf and onto a table, and the first proper coffee shops opened in Venice in the 17th century. Small dark rooms under the arcades where you could sit down. By the 1700s they had multiplied all over the city, and one of them, opened on the Piazza San Marco in 1720 under the name of the Triumphant Venice, was nicknamed after its owner and is still called Florian today. It has been serving coffee on that square for 300 years, through the fall of the Republic, Napoleon, the Austrians, 2 world wars, and the arrival of the cruise ships. You can go and pay far too much for a cup there this afternoon, but before any of that could happen comfortably, there was a problem to be dealt with. And it was not a commercial problem. It was a religious one. Coffee came from the Muslim world. Everybody knew that. Its name was Arabic. It arrived on ships from Ottoman ports. And for a Europe that had spent centuries at war with the Ottomans and had very nearly lost, that was not a neutral fact. So the objection began to be raised in Rome. This dark, bitter, foreign drink, this thing that Muslims drank in place of the wine forbidden to them, this was suspect. Wine was sanctified. Wine was in the sacrament, and here was a substitute for it. Coming out of the lands of the infidel, spreading through Christian cities. Some priests, according to the story, went so far as to call it the bitter invention of Satan. The matter was brought to Pope Clement VIII. Now, what happens next is the single most repeated anecdote in the history of coffee. And it is almost certainly not true, and we are going to tell it anyway. The Pope, faced with a demand that he condemn a drink he had never encountered, is said to have made an entirely sensible request. He asked for a cup. Picture it. An old man in a room in the Vatican, with clergymen standing around him waiting for a ruling, and somebody brings in a small cup of something black and steaming that half the men present regard as an instrument of the devil. He lifts it. He smells it. He drinks. And he says, in the version that has come down to us, that this devil's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the unbelievers have exclusive use of it. So we shall cheat Satan. We shall baptize it, and make it a Christian beverage. Historians will tell you, correctly, that there is no contemporary record of this happening. It appears in print long afterwards, with the neat shape of a story polished by retelling rather than written by a witness. But keep it, because the outline of it is true even if the scene is invented. The Roman Church did not condemn coffee. There was no bull against it, no prohibition, no campaign. Catholic Europe took it up quickly and without much argument. And within 100 years, priests were drinking it in the morning like everybody else. Whatever was said in that room, the ruling that mattered was silence. Meanwhile, the empire coffee had come from was making one last enormous push into Europe, and it was about to hand the continent a gift by accident. In the summer of 1683, an Ottoman army of somewhere near 150,000 men laid siege to Vienna. The city held for 2 months. Starving. Its walls mined and cracking, until a relief army came over the Kahlenberg Hills and broke the siege in a single afternoon. The Ottomans withdrew in disorder, and they left their camp behind them. Tents, cannon, oxen, gold, and sacks of small green beans that most of the Viennese, poking through the wreckage, had no idea what to do with. There is a story that they thought it was camel feed. The legend hands those sacks to a man named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, a Polish adventurer who had lived in the Ottoman lands, spoke Turkish, and had slipped through enemy lines during the siege, disguised as a Turkish soldier to carry a message to the relief force. He asked for the beans as his reward. So the story goes. Opened Vienna's first coffeehouse with them, and softened the bitter Turkish brew with milk and honey for the local palate. It is a wonderful story, and it is largely later invention. Sharpened up in the 1800s when the city wanted a hero to hang the tradition on. The first documented coffee license in Vienna went to an Armenian merchant named Johannes Diodato, 2 years after the siege. But the institution that grew out of it needs no legend at all, because it is still there, and it is one of the great achievements of European public life. The Viennese coffeehouse. Marble-topped tables, bentwood chairs, newspapers from a dozen cities clamped into wooden rods and hung on a rack by the door, free to anyone sitting down. A small glass of water served beside the cup, and refilled, without asking, for as long as you stay. And the unwritten law at the center of it, which is that 1 cup of coffee buys you a table for as long as you want it. 4 hours. 6. Write your novel there. Play chess. Read every newspaper on the rack. Nobody will hurry you. And the waiter, who will be dressed better than you are, will not so much as glance at your empty cup, which leaves one more country, and it is the one where all of this is about to go strange. In the year 1650, in Oxford, a man remembered only as Jacob, a Jewish immigrant, opened a coffee house at the Sign of the Angel. 2 years later, the idea reached London, and it arrived in the hands of a servant. His name was Pasqua Rosé. He was born into the Greek community of Ragusa, on what is now the Croatian coast, and he had gone to work for an English merchant of the Levant Company who was living in Smyrna and had acquired a serious daily coffee habit there. When the merchant came home, he brought Rosé with him, and Rosé went on making the coffee. The merchant's friends began turning up in numbers to drink it, which became inconvenient. So Rosé was set up in business on his own in a shed against the churchyard wall in St. Michael's Alley, off Cornhill. He printed a handbill to advertise. It survives. It claims that coffee will cure headaches, help digestion, prevent and cure dropsy, gout and scurvy, sharpen the eyesight, and is particularly good against sore eyes, provided you hold your head over the steam. Almost none of this was true. It did not matter in the slightest. The shed was overwhelmed. Within 50 years, London would have more coffeehouses than it had churches, and what happened inside them would go on to produce the insurance market, the stock exchange, the modern newspaper, and a king so alarmed that he tried to shut the whole thing down. To understand what happened in London over the following 50 years, you have to understand the price of admission. 1 penny. That was it. 1 penny at the door bought you entry, and a dish of coffee. And with those 2 things, it bought you something that did not exist anywhere else in English life. It bought you a seat at a long common table, and the right to speak to anyone sitting at it. That last part is difficult to appreciate now. England in the 1600s was a country organized almost entirely around rank. Where you sat in church was decided by your standing. How you addressed a man depended on his father. There were rooms you could not enter, clubs that would not have you, and 100 small rituals to remind everybody where they stood. And then, here was a low room full of tobacco smoke, where a ship's chandler, a mathematician, a bookseller, and a man writing seditious pamphlets under a false name all sat on the same bench. And the custom of the house was that if you were at the table, you were in the conversation. People started calling them penny universities, and the joke had a hard edge of truth in it. A young man with no money and no connections could, for the price of a loaf of bread, spend an afternoon listening to some of the best minds in Europe argue about the movement of the planets, and then ask a question, and be answered. Now, what actually came out of those rooms is the part that seems invented. Start with a coffeehouse on Tower Street, near the docks, kept by a man named Edward Lloyd. Because it was close to the water, it filled up with shipowners, captains, merchants who had cargo at sea, and men with money looking for somewhere to put it. And Lloyd was clever. He worked out that what these people actually wanted was information. So he began collecting it. Which ships had sailed, which had arrived, which had been taken by privateers off the Barbary coast, and which had simply not been heard of for 11 months. He had the lists read aloud from a pulpit in the room, and later printed them. Then the second thing happened, and it is the thing that matters. A man with a ship going to Jamaica would describe the voyage, and other men in the room, judging the risk, would write their names one under another on a sheet of paper, each taking a share of the loss if the ship went down, in exchange for a share of the fee if it came home. Underneath the written description, underwriting, that is where the word comes from, and it comes from a room with sawdust on the floor. Lloyd died. The coffeehouse eventually stopped serving coffee, but the men and the practice carried on. And today, Lloyd's of London insures oil rigs and satellites and the legs of footballers. And it is still, structurally, a group of people agreeing to share a risk in a room. Now walk a few minutes west to Exchange Alley, a narrow lane off Cornhill, and go into a place called Jonathan's. This one filled with a different crowd. The Royal Exchange, the official place for trading, had a habit of expelling stock jobbers for being too loud, too aggressive, and generally too vulgar for the premises. So the stock jobbers, having nowhere else to go, went to the coffeehouse. And in that coffeehouse a man named John Casting began, at the end of the 1600s, posting a list on the wall of the current prices of stocks and commodities, twice a week. A room where you could see what things were worth, and buy them, and sell them. Jonathan's burned down and moved, and eventually the men in it stopped calling it a coffeehouse and started calling it the Stock Exchange. It never really left the room. 2 streets away, near the Inns of Court, stood the Grecian, which was the coffeehouse of the natural philosophers. The men who would become the Royal Society drank there, and argued there, and on at least one celebrated occasion dissected a dolphin on one of the tables in front of everybody. Isaac Newton moved in that circle, and in Covent Garden there was Buttons, which had a brass lion's head set into the wall with an open mouth. You posted your letters and essays into the lion. They were collected and considered for publication, and the best of them appeared in print a few days later. The Spectator and the Tatler, the ancestors of every newspaper column that has ever been written, were coffeehouse papers in the fullest sense. They were written in coffeehouses. They were largely about coffeehouses, and they were read aloud in coffeehouses to men who could not read, who then argued about them. So within roughly 2 generations, 4 low, smoky rooms in a single square mile of London had produced the modern insurance market, the modern stock market, the working culture of modern science, and the modern newspaper. All of it fueled by a drink that had been in the country for less than a lifetime. Not everybody was delighted. In 1674, a pamphlet appeared under the title The Women's Petition Against Coffee, and it is one of the funniest documents of the century. It complains, in language considerably too vulgar to read out in a video meant to help you sleep, that the men of England have become useless, that they sit all day in these houses babbling and dribbling over their cups, that they come home late, wretched, and entirely unfit for the duties a wife might reasonably expect. It demands that coffee be forbidden to any man under the age of 60, and that England return to good, honest beer. A men's answer was published within weeks, equally coarse, insisting the exact opposite. It is almost certainly not what it appears to be. Very few scholars now think it was written by women at all. It reads as satire, and the target underneath the jokes was probably political, because attacking the coffee houses as ridiculous was a good deal safer than attacking them as dangerous. And a year later, somebody far more powerful decided to close them. On the 29th of December, 1675, King Charles II issued a proclamation for the suppression of coffee houses. The wording is worth hearing, because it is almost identical in spirit to what the Ottoman court had been saying 40 years earlier and half a world away. These houses, it said, had produced very evil and dangerous effects, being places where false, malicious and scandalous reports were devised and spread abroad to the defamation of the government and the disturbance of the peace of the realm. He gave them until the 10th of January to close. What followed was one of the fastest political retreats in English history. The merchants were furious. The lawyers pointed out inconvenient things about licenses already paid for. The city, which lent the crown money, made itself unpleasant. And the king, who had been restored to a throne his father had lost and had a very fine instinct for how much pressure a monarchy could take, folded completely. The proclamation was withdrawn on the 8th of January, 2 days before it was due to take effect. It had lasted 11 days and never came into force at all. Across the Channel, the same thing was happening in a different accent. In 1686, a Sicilian named Francesco Procopio opened a café near the Comédie Française. And instead of the low benches of Istanbul or the sawdust of London, he installed mirrors, chandeliers, marble tabletops, and small elegant chairs, which is the moment the café stops being a smoky room for men and becomes something you might take a woman to. Over the following century, the tables of the Procope held Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and, on visits, Benjamin Franklin. The Encyclopédie, the vast project to put all human knowledge between covers and thereby quietly dismantle the authority of both church and crown, was argued into existence partly in that room. Voltaire is supposed to have drunk between 40 and 50 cups a day, which is almost certainly a wild exaggeration. And in any case, the cups were very small. When somebody warned him coffee was a slow poison, he is said to have replied that it must be very slow indeed, since he had been drinking it for 65 years. It is worth pausing on what the underlying change actually was. Europe already had public rooms. It had taverns, and it had had them forever. But alcohol does something specific to a room. It makes it warmer, louder, more sentimental, and considerably less precise. And after 3 hours, nobody in it can hold a complicated argument in their head. Coffee did the reverse. Coffee made a room in which 12 men could sit for 6 hours and stay sharp the entire time, and remember what was said an hour ago. and follow a chain of reasoning to the end of it. That is the invention, not the beverage. The sober room. And the institutions that came out of those sober rooms are, almost without exception, still standing. But all of it. Every insurance policy and stock price and scientific paper and newspaper column depended on a supply of beans that Europe did not control and could not grow, arriving from a country that killed every seed before it left the harbour, which meant that sooner or later somebody was going to have to steal the plant. By the end of the 1600s, Europe had a habit and no supply of its own. London, Paris, Amsterdam, Vienna and Venice were now drinking coffee daily, in quantity, and the entire volume of it had to be bought from one small mountainous country at the bottom of the Red Sea, at whatever price that country decided to ask, shipped through one shallow harbour, and paid for in silver, and every bean that arrived had been boiled or parched so that it could never be planted. Europe was buying the drink and permanently locked out of the crop. For merchants who had just spent a century learning to sail anywhere on earth and take whatever they found there, this was intolerable. So the plant was stolen. Not once, but 4 separate times over about 100 years, by 4 very different men. And between them, they put coffee on 3 continents and set up everything that follows. The first of them was Dutch, and he was patient. His name was Peter van den Broeke, and he was a merchant of the Dutch East India Company, which was less a company than a state with ships. He spent years in the Red Sea trade and made himself useful and welcome at Mocha. And at some point in the 1600s, he came away with what nobody was supposed to be able to get. Not boiled beans. Living plants. Getting them home was its own problem. A tropical highland shrub on a wooden ship rounding the Cape of Good Hope is a plant that mostly dies. Some survived. They went into the Hortus Botanicus in Amsterdam, one of the oldest botanical gardens in the world. And there, in a cold, flat city where the sun is a rumour for half the year, Dutch gardeners kept a piece of the Ethiopian understory alive under glass winter after winter. Then the Dutch did exactly what the Dutch always did. They took it somewhere warm that they controlled. First to Ceylon. Then, in the 1690s, to Java, in what is now Indonesia, where the volcanic soil and the altitude and the rainfall turned out to suit the plant so perfectly that within a few decades the Dutch were shipping coffee to Europe in volumes Yemen could not match. Java grew coffee so successfully that its name detached itself from the island and attached itself to the drink. And 300 years later, people in American diners still call a cup of coffee a cup of Java without the faintest idea that they are naming an Indonesian island. The monopoly was broken, and in 1714, the Dutch, feeling secure and rather pleased with themselves, made a diplomatic gesture that would cost them a great deal. The city fathers of Amsterdam presented a single healthy coffee plant, grown from their own stock, as a gift to King Louis XIV of France. It was carried to Paris and installed with great ceremony in the Royal Botanical Garden, the Jardin des Plantes, where it was cared for like a visiting dignitary. Hold on to that plant. It matters more than the man it was given to. The second theft happened at almost the same time and had nothing to do with commerce at all. The story concerns a Sufi from southern India, remembered by the name Baba Budan, who made the pilgrimage to Mecca and came home by way of Mocha. Somewhere in that port he drank coffee, and it seems he understood immediately what it was worth to the kind of men he belonged to, the ones who sat up all night praying. Taking fertile seed out was forbidden. So, according to the tradition, he took 7 of them and bound them against his body under his clothes, and walked out with them. 7, and not 6 or 8. because in Islamic tradition, 7 is a number of completeness and blessing, which is the detail that tells you how he thought of what he was doing, smuggling. It was carrying something sacred home. He planted them in the hills of Chikmagalur, in Karnataka, in southern India. They grew. Those hills are called the Baba Budangiri today, and there is a shrine there. And the entire Indian coffee industry traces itself back to 7 seeds carried against a pilgrim's skin. The third theft is the one they made into a legend, and it is the most human. In 1723, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu, serving on Martinique in the Caribbean, came to Paris on leave with an idea. The island had the climate. The island had land. What the island did not have was a coffee plant, and there was one sitting in a glass house in the Jardin des Plantes. By his own account, getting a cutting was extremely difficult, and involved persuasion, a physician's help, and possibly a certain amount of climbing over a wall at night. However, he came by it. He sailed from Nantes with a young plant in a box glazed on top, so that it could take the sun and be shut against the salt wind. First there were the pirates. A Tunisian corsair pursued the ship in the Mediterranean, and they escaped it. Barely. Then a storm, bad enough that the ship nearly went over, and de Clieu spent it lashing the box down and keeping the water off. Then something stranger. There was a passenger on board who, for reasons that have never been satisfactorily explained, wanted the plant dead. He got at the box, and de Clieu fought him off. And by the time it was over, a branch had been torn away. And then the wind died. A ship becalmed on the Atlantic in the age of sail was a ship in serious trouble, because the water on board was finite and the distance was not. The captain put everyone on ration, a cup a day, or less, and in that heat, with his own throat closing up, Gabriel de Clieu took half of his daily water and gave it to the plant. He did that for weeks. He arrived in Martinique sunburnt, half-starved and severely dehydrated, carrying a battered coffee shrub with one branch missing, and he planted it on his estate and had it guarded with thorn hedges and armed men because he did not trust his neighbors. It lived. Within 3 years it fruited. Within about 50 years, the island had something on the order of 18 million coffee trees on it, and seedlings from that stock had gone out to Saint-Domingue, to Guadeloupe, and from there onto the mainland of Central and South America. An enormous share of all the coffee now grown in the Americas descends from that single plant, in that single box, on that single deck. Almost everything dramatic here comes from de Clieu himself, writing long afterwards, and a man telling his own tale tends to improve it. But the plant arrived, and the trees are there, which brings us to the 4th theft. And the 4th is not heroic at all. It is a seduction. By the 1720s, Portugal could see what was happening. Brazil had millions of acres of exactly the right land, tropical, high, well-watered, and the labor system, which we will come to and which is the darkest part of this whole story, was already in place. What Brazil did not have was a plant, and neither the French nor the Dutch had any intention of providing one. So in 1727, the Portuguese sent an officer named Francisco de Melo Palheta north to French Guiana. The stated purpose was diplomacy. The French and the Dutch were disputing a stretch of border in the jungle and had asked for a neutral party to help settle it. Palheta was a good choice for that. He was also, by every account, extremely handsome and extremely charming. He settled the border. He also, according to the story that has followed him for 3 centuries, settled rather more comfortably than that into the household of the French governor, and, specifically, into the affections of the governor's wife. When the time came for him to leave, there was a farewell banquet in Cayenne, formal and public, with the governor present. And at the end of it, his hostess came forward and presented him, in front of everybody, with a large and beautiful bouquet of flowers. He thanked her. He took it with him. Buried in the middle of that bouquet, wrapped in the stems, were fertile coffee seeds and living cuttings. He carried them across the border into Pará, in the north of Brazil, and planted them. But over the following century, coffee moved south and inland, through Maranhão and Bahia, into Rio de Janeiro, and finally into the deep red earth of São Paulo and Minas Gerais, where it found the best coffee ground on the planet. Brazil is today, and has been for more than 150 years without interruption, the largest coffee producer on Earth, growing roughly a third of everything the world drinks. And the origin of it, in the version everybody tells, is a bunch of flowers handed over at a dinner party. So, in the space of 1 century, a plant that had been locked inside one mountain range was growing on 3 continents. In the hands of 4 European powers, the monopoly was finished. The price was going to fall. Coffee was about to become something ordinary people could afford every single day. And that is exactly where this story stops being charming. Because coffee ripens unevenly and must be picked by hand, over and over, by enormous numbers of people. And the men planting those millions of trees had already decided who was going to do it, and how much they intended to pay. This is the part of the story that does not go on the packaging, and it is going to be told plainly, because it deserves that. Start with a problem in botany, because the horror grows directly out of it. Almost every crop that made colonial fortunes could be harvested in a single sweep. Wheat is cut all at once. Sugarcane is cut all at once. Coffee is not. On one branch of one tree, on one morning, you will find hard green cherries, half-colored yellow ones, perfect deep red ones, and a few that have gone soft and past their moment. They come ready over a period of weeks, and the ripe ones must be taken and the green ones left. Because a green cherry makes bad coffee, and picking it destroys next season's growth. Which means there is only one way to harvest coffee properly, and it has not changed in 500 years. A human being, standing at the tree, choosing each cherry with their fingers, then coming back, then coming back again, then coming back a 4th time. A skilled picker might strip 100 pounds of cherries, which will dry down to something like 20 pounds of green coffee, which is perhaps enough for a few hundred cups. Now put that against what Europe wanted coffee for every household in London and Paris and Amsterdam, every morning, forever. Do the arithmetic on how many hands that requires, and you arrive at the answer the planters arrived at. It needs an enormous quantity of labor, at a task that cannot be rushed, for a product sold at a price that leaves nothing over for wages. So the wages were simply not paid. That is the whole mechanism. The coffee boom of the 1700s and the transatlantic slave trade were not 2 separate stories that happened to overlap. They were the same story. And the ships that carried the coffee north sailed the same routes as the ships that carried the people west. Nowhere shows it more clearly than a colony on the western third of an island in the Caribbean. The French called it Saint-Domingue. Today it is Haiti. In the 1780s it was, without any serious competition, the single most profitable piece of colonial property on the face of the earth. Something close to 800 sugar estates, and around 2,800 coffee plantations, most of them up in the mountains, on land too steep for cane, cleared and terraced by hand. By the year 1789, That one colony was producing somewhere between half and 60% of all the coffee consumed on the planet. The wealth flowing out of it underwrote a serious portion of the French economy and paid for a great deal of the elegance that people now travel to France to admire. It was worked by around 500,000 enslaved people, and it killed them at a rate that is hard to write down calmly. Conditions in the mountain coffee plantations were, if anything, worse than on the sugar estates, because the work was in thinner air on steeper ground and the food was worse. The enslaved population of Saint-Domingue did not reproduce itself. It could not. Deaths outran births year after year. And the only reason the colony continued to function was that ships kept arriving from the coast of West Africa with replacements. That is not an accident of a badly run system. That was the system, working as designed. In August of 1791, it ended. The revolt began in the northern plain and spread. And what followed was not a riot, but a war lasting 13 years, fought in turn against the French, the Spanish, the British, and then the French again, when Napoleon sent an army to restore slavery and lost most of it to fever. Out of it came Toussaint Louverture, born enslaved on a plantation, who turned out to be one of the finest military and political minds of his century, and who died in a cold cell in a French fortress, having been seized under a flag of truce. On the first day of January, 1804, Haiti declared itself independent. It was the second republic in the Americas, and it remains the only nation in history created by an enslaved population that fought its way free and kept what it won. And the world made it pay. The plantations were gone, burned and abandoned, and the coffee exports collapsed and never came close to returning. Then, in 1825, France sent warships to sit off the harbor and demanded an indemnity, compensation to the former slaveholders for their lost property, which is to say, compensation for the loss of the people themselves. Haiti, in order to be recognized as a country and to trade at all, agreed to pay, and borrowed from French banks in order to do it. It went on paying well into the 20th century. So the nation that had produced most of the world's coffee spent more than 100 years sending its money to the people who had once owned its citizens. If you have ever wondered why Haiti is poor, that is not the whole answer, but it is a very large part of the beginning of it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Dutch were running a version of the same arrangement without the word slavery attached to it. In 1830, the colonial government introduced a policy called the cultuurstelsel, usually translated as the cultivation system. It was elegant on paper. Instead of taxing Javanese peasants in money, the government would take payment in crops. Each village was obliged to set aside a portion of its land, in theory around a fifth, for export crops chosen by the state. Coffee, sugar, indigo. They would grow them, hand them over, and be paid a price set by the government. In practice, the fifth became a third or a half in many districts. The fixed prices were a fraction of what the crops fetched in Amsterdam. The labor demanded often exceeded what a family could give and still feed itself. And coffee in particular was grown high on the slopes, far from the villages. So men walked for hours to work land that fed nobody. For the Netherlands, it was a triumph. At its height, the profit from the cultivation system was supplying a very large share of the entire Dutch national budget. It was known in Dutch politics, without embarrassment, as the betig slot, the favorable balance. For Java, it produced famine. In the 1840s, districts in Cirebon and central Java went hungry in a way they had not before, on some of the most fertile land in the world. Because the land was full of coffee and indigo, instead of rice. What ended it, eventually, was a novel. In 1860, a former colonial official writing under the name Multatuli, which is Latin for "I have suffered much," published a book called Max Havelaar. It was furious, strange, and enormously popular, and it did to the Dutch conscience roughly what Uncle Tom's Cabin did to the American one. The system was wound down over the following years, and more than a century later, when campaigners in the Netherlands wanted a name for the first certification mark, guaranteeing that a farmer had been paid decently for his coffee, they called it Max Havelaar. And then there is Brazil, which was the largest of all of them. The coffee frontier moved through Brazil like a slow fire, down the Paraíba Valley behind Rio de Janeiro, then west across São Paulo. The pattern was always the same. Clear the Atlantic forest. Burn what will burn. Plant coffee in rows running straight up and down the slope. Work the soil until it is exhausted. Then move on and do it again further west. Millions of acres of one of the most biologically rich forests on Earth went into that. The estates were called fazendas, and they ran on enslaved Africans. Brazil imported more enslaved people from Africa than any other country in the Americas, by a very wide margin. On the fazendas, the day began before light and ended after dark, and the accounting behind it was explicit and written down. It was calculated to be cheaper to work a man until he died and buy another than to feed, house and doctor him well enough to keep him alive. That calculation is in the ledgers. Brazil did not abolish slavery until the 13th of May, 1888. It was the last country in the entire Western Hemisphere to do so. And coffee is a substantial part of the reason why. Because the coffee planters were the wealthiest and most powerful bloc in the country, and they fought abolition to the very end. When it finally came, the monarchy that signed it fell within 18 months. What replaced it was not freedom for the people who had been enslaved, most of whom were left with nothing at all. What replaced it was over 1 million European immigrants, mostly Italians, recruited with promises and shipped in to work the same trees under a contract system called colonial. Their conditions were better. They were not, by any reasonable standard, good, and a great many of them wrote home, telling their relatives not to come. So here is the thing to sit with. Said once and then left alone. For most of the modern history of this drink, the people who grew it did not drink it, and the people who drank it had no idea who grew it. The distance between the cup and the hand was the entire point of the arrangement. Coffee was now cheap, and abundant, and everywhere. And in a harbor in Massachusetts, a crowd of men in a very bad mood were about to make it patriotic. On a cold December night in 1773, a group of men with their faces darkened went aboard 3 ships tied up at Griffin's Wharf in Boston Harbor, broke open the holds, and spent about 3 hours methodically hauling 342 chests of tea up onto the deck, splitting them with hatchets, and tipping the contents into the water. It was done quietly and with a certain amount of care. One man who tried to pocket some tea for himself was roughed up by the others, because this was a political act and not a robbery. The tea belonged to the East India Company, and the argument was about who had the right to tax it. What is told less often is what happened to what people drank the following morning, because tea, overnight, became a political object in the American colonies. Not just the taxed tea, but tea itself, the whole habit of it. A man seen drinking tea was a man announcing which side he was on. Merchants who kept selling it had their windows broken, and into that gap walked the other hot drink, the one that came from the Caribbean and South America rather than from a British monopoly. Coffee, and it arrived. as it always does, with the room attached. The Merchants' Coffee House on Wall Street in New York became the place where the merchants of the city argued out the revolution, and where the men who would run the new republic's finances later founded a bank in the back room. In Boston, the Green Dragon Tavern and Coffee House was where the Sons of Liberty gathered, and it was later called the headquarters of the revolution by men who had been in it. The same institution that had frightened an Ottoman sultan and a Stuart king was now doing precisely the same work in a third country. And once again, nobody in authority had planned for it. Now, a fair word about the myth. Americans did not switch from tea to coffee in one patriotic weekend. The change took decades. And what really finished it was arithmetic. Congress kept tariffs on tea and eventually let coffee in duty-free. And just as that happened, Brazil began flooding the Atlantic with cheap beans. Coffee became the thing a working man could afford twice a day. Patriotism opened the door, and price walked through it. But it stuck. The United States has been, for most of the time since, the largest coffee-drinking nation on the face of the earth. And the whole enormous edifice of the American diner, the office pot, the roadside cup, the bottomless refill, traces back to a night when a few dozen men decided to ruin a cargo of somebody else's tea. 16 years later, in another country, another crowd, another cafe, on the 12th of July, 1789, Paris was frightened. The king had dismissed his popular finance minister 2 days earlier. Troops were massing outside the city, and nobody knew whether the army was about to be turned loose on the population. In the gardens of the Palais Royal, a crowd was milling about with nothing to do but be afraid together. The Palais Royal was an unusual place. It belonged to the king's cousin, the Duke of Orléans, and because it was private ducal property, the ordinary police of Paris had no clear authority inside it. So it had filled up with cafes, bookshops, printers and pamphleteers, and it had become the one square in the capital where a man could stand up and say whatever he liked without expecting a hand on his shoulder. Outside a place called the Café de Foix, a young lawyer named Camille Desmoulins, who was known chiefly for a stammer bad enough that he had failed at the bar, climbed up onto a table, and whether it was the moment or the fear or the sheer necessity of it, the stammer went. He shouted that the dismissal was the signal for a massacre of patriots, that they must take up arms tonight, and he tore a green leaf from a tree and put it in his hat as a badge. The crowd stripped the trees bare, copying him. 2 days later, the Bastille fell. The revolution was not caused by coffee. But the room where it was set off was a cafe. And that is not a coincidence either. That is what those rooms were for. Which brings us to the rulers who had worked this out and did not care for it at all. In Prussia, in 1777, Frederick II, called the Great, published a declaration worth quoting for how personally offended it sounds. "It is disgusting," he said, "to notice the increase in the quantity of coffee used by my subjects, and the amount of money that goes out of the country in consequence. Everybody is using coffee. This must be prevented. My people must drink beer. Many battles have been won by soldiers nourished on beer. And the king does not believe that coffee-drinking soldiers can be relied upon in hardship." 2 things were going on underneath the bluster. One was real. Prussia had no colonies and no coffee. So every bean was bought from foreigners with silver that left the country and did not come back. The other was that beer was brewed at home and taxed at home, and the king's treasury liked that arrangement very much. So he made the roasting of coffee a royal monopoly. If you wanted coffee legally, you bought it from the state, at the state's price, and only the nobility. The clergy and senior officials could get a license to roast it themselves. Naturally, everybody else roasted it in their kitchens with the shutters closed. And this produced the most peculiar occupation in the history of the drink. Roasting coffee is not a discreet activity. The smell carries down a street and around a corner. So the king recruited a corps of men, several hundred of them, largely disabled veterans of his own wars who needed employment, and set them to walk the streets of Berlin, sniffing. Their job was to smell out illegal roasting, follow the scent to the house, and report it. Berliners called them the Kaffeeschnüffler, the coffee sniffers. They were despised, mocked in songs and in prints, and the whole scheme was so hated and so ineffective that it was abandoned within about 6 years. The coffee went on being roasted. It always does. Sweden went further than anybody, and Sweden went stranger. The Swedes banned coffee, not once, but 5 separate times between the 1750s and the 1820s, seizing cups and saucers from private houses, which no other European country managed. And attached to those bans is a story that has survived a great deal of skepticism. King Gustav III was convinced coffee was a slow poison, and decided to prove it. He found a pair of twin brothers who had been condemned to death, and commuted their sentences to life imprisonment on one condition. For the rest of their lives, one brother would drink 3 pots of coffee every day, and the other would drink 3 pots of tea. 2 doctors were appointed to observe the experiment. The experiment was a complete failure, and the reason it failed is delightful. Both doctors died first. Then, in 1792, Gustav himself was shot at a masked ball at the Stockholm Opera and died of his wounds. The tea-drinking twin eventually died at the age of 83. The coffee-drinking twin outlived him, and nobody bothered to record when he finally went. Which means the last man standing in the king's great medical experiment simply walked out of the historical record with a cup in his hand. Almost certainly this story has been improved somewhere along the way. Enjoy it anyway. And then there was the one blockade that actually worked, and it changed what Europe tastes like to this day. From 1806, Napoleon attempted to strangle Britain economically by closing the whole of continental Europe to British trade. Britain, having the better navy, responded by closing the sea. And since colonial goods came by sea, the coffee stopped. In Paris and Amsterdam, coffee turned back into a luxury within a single year. So Europe went looking in the ground. What it found was chicory, a scruffy plant with a pale blue flower that grows along roadsides all over the continent, and had been used as a folk remedy for centuries. It's ruet, dried, roasted dark and ground, produces something startlingly convincing. It is dark. It is bitter. It has a woody, faintly caramel edge, and it makes a thick brown liquid that looks exactly right in a cup. It contains no caffeine whatsoever, so it does absolutely nothing. But it tastes like something. Governments encouraged it. Households learned to make their coffee go twice as far by mixing it in. The blockade collapsed with Napoleon in 1814. The chicory did not go anywhere. People had grown up on the blend and now preferred it, so it stayed in French coffee and in Belgian coffee. And when French settlers carried their habits to Louisiana, it went with them. And it is still there. That thick, dark, slightly sweet coffee they serve in New Orleans is a Napoleonic wartime substitute that has outlived the war by 200 years. So there is the record. A sultan with a sword, a king with a proclamation, a king with a corps of professional sniffers, a king with a pair of condemned twins, an emperor with a continental blockade. Every one of them lost. And while they were losing, Something quiet was happening in workshops in Pittsburgh and Dresden and Turin that would change coffee more than any of them. Before we get to the workshops, there is an island to visit, because the plant was about to do something that no king and no emperor had managed. And it did it without any human help at all. Go to Ceylon, the island now called Sri Lanka, in the middle of the 1800s. If you had walked the Central Highlands then, you would not have recognized them. The forest that had covered those hills for as long as anyone could say had been felled and burned by British planters over the course of about 30 years. And in its place stood coffee. Not a few plantations. Hundreds of thousands of acres of it, running from one valley to the next. Up the slopes around Kandy, in rows, under open sky, with almost nothing else growing anywhere near it. It was worked by Tamil labourers brought over from southern India, walking in through the jungle from the north coast in their thousands each season, many of whom died of fever on the road before they ever reached the estates. It made enormous fortunes for men in London who had never seen the place. By the 1860s, the island was one of the 2 or 3 great coffee regions on the face of the planet, and every single one of those millions of trees was, botanically speaking, more or less the same tree. All of it Arabica. All of it descended from a very narrow pool of stock. All of it planted on the same soil under the same conditions. A field like that is not a farm. It is an invitation. In 1869, on an estate near Madulsima, somebody turned over a coffee leaf and noticed small orange-yellow spots on the underside, like a scattering of rust-coloured dust. There was some concern. A specimen was sent to Kew Gardens in London, and a mycologist gave the thing a name, Hemileia vastatrix, half smooth and devastating. Here is what it does. And it explains the whole rest of the century. The fungus does not attack the fruit, and it does not attack the trunk. It attacks the leaf. Spores land on the underside, find the pores the leaf breathes through, and grow inside. Within a few weeks the leaf yellows, and then it fouls. A coffee tree that has lost its leaves is not dead. That is the cruelty of it. It stands there, apparently alive, and it puts out new leaves next season. And those leaves are infected too and fall as well. But a tree without leaves cannot photosynthesize. And a tree that cannot photosynthesize cannot ripen fruit. So the harvest fails. Then it fails again. Then the tree, exhausted from repeatedly regrowing foliage it cannot keep, gives up. And the spores travel on the wind, and on the clothes of the pickers, and on the tools, and in the rain running downhill. Now hear the numbers slowly, because they are the reason this matters. In the year 1870, 1 year after those first orange spots, Ceylon exported roughly 100 million pounds of coffee. By 1889, 19 years later, it exported around 5 million. That is not a downturn. That is an extinction. In under 2 decades, an entire national industry simply ceased to exist. Planters who had been rich in 1870 were bankrupt by 1880. Estates were abandoned with the trees still standing in rows. Banks in London failed over it. Men walked off their land and left the country. Nobody could stop it. They tried everything. They tried sulfur. They tried lime. They tried pruning. They tried burning the affected fields. They tried planting at higher altitude and hoping the cold would hold it back. Nothing worked. And nothing has ever really worked since. There is still no cure for coffee leaf rust. There are only varieties that resist it for a while, until it changes and gets past them again. And out of that disaster came a habit that is now so fixed in the world's mind that most people assume it is ancient. 2 years before the rust appeared. A Scottish planter named James Taylor had begun experimenting on a corner of the Lulkandira estate with a different crop. 19 acres of tea. It was a sideline, a curiosity, the sort of thing a careful man does with land he is not using. As the coffee died around him, that sideline became the only thing left. Tea does not get coffee leaf rust. Tea grows very happily in the Ceylon highlands. So the ruined coffee estates were replanted with tea, one after another, through the 1880s, until the same hills that had been coffee were tea from end to end. And in 1890, a grocer from Glasgow named Thomas Lipton, who had built a chain of shops selling cheap food to working people, sailed out to Ceylon, bought up failed coffee estates at bargain prices, and began shipping tea directly from his own land to his own shops with no middlemen in between. Direct from the tea garden to the teapot, as the advertising said. Tea in Britain went from a luxury to something a labourer's family drank 3 times a day. So sit with this for a moment, because it is one of the strangest causal chains anywhere. Britain is a nation of tea drinkers, famously, definingly, to the point where it is a national joke. And a very large part of the reason is that a microscopic fungus with no interest in geopolitics ate the leaves off the coffee trees of one island in the Indian Ocean in the 1870s. Change that one detail and the British might have gone on drinking coffee. And half of what we think of as national character would look different. The rust never stopped. It went to India, to Java, to Africa. In 1970, it turned up in the state of Bahia in Brazil, which had never seen it. And from there, it worked its way across the Americas over the following decades. In 2012 and 2013, it swept Central America, damaging well over half the growing area in some countries, and putting hundreds of thousands of people out of work in a single season. It is still out there. It is still moving uphill as the climate warms. That is one way for a crop to fail. Now here is the opposite one, and it is almost funnier, except that it wasn't. Brazil, by the early 20th century, was producing something like 80% of the world's coffee. And a country that produces 4/5 of anything has a peculiar problem, which is that its harvest is the world price. There is nobody else to absorb a mistake. Coffee trees also have a rhythm the market cannot control. They tend to alternate. A tree that fruits heavily one year exhausts itself and fruits lightly the next. Across an entire country. That means enormous crops followed by small ones. In 1906, an extraordinary crop came in, far larger than the world could drink, and everyone in Sao Paulo could see the price about to fall through the floor. So the states of Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais and Rio de Janeiro did something that had never really been done before. They borrowed heavily from foreign banks and bought the surplus coffee themselves, then locked it in warehouses and refused to sell it. They called it valorization. Valorization. It is, in effect, the invention of the modern agricultural price support, and governments have been doing versions of it ever since with wheat, milk, butter, and everything else. It did not raise the price. It did stop the collapse, which was the point. But you can only warehouse a mountain for so long. And then came 1929. Coffee fell from around 22.5 cents a pound in 1929 to about 8 cents 2 years later. World demand shrank because the world was broke. And Brazil, by 1930, was sitting on roughly 26 million bags of unsold coffee in storage, which was more than the entire planet had consumed in the previous 12 months. The warehouses were full. The next harvest was coming anyway. In October of that year, a coup put Getulio Vargas in power, and his government made a decision that still sounds unreal when you say it out loud. It would buy coffee from the growers, and then destroy it. Between 1931 and 1944, Brazil deliberately destroyed something in the region of 78 million bags of coffee. Several years of world consumption. Bought and eliminated. It was burned in enormous pyres. It was dumped into the sea by the shipload, until the tide brought it back onto the beaches and they had to stop. It was buried in trenches. For a while, railway locomotives in São Paulo state were fired with coffee beans instead of coal, because coffee was cheaper. Around the port of Santos, people said the smell of burning coffee hung in the air along the coast for years, drifting in from the fires inland. Imagine that. A whole coastline that smells permanently of roasting, and nothing to drink at the end of it. So there are the two ways a crop can destroy the people who depend on it. Far too little, and far too much. Coffee has now done both, on the largest possible scale, within 70 years of itself. And in between those two catastrophes, in quiet workshops in Pittsburgh and Dresden and Turin, ordinary people were solving much smaller problems, and changing the drink forever. For most of the 19th century, coffee at home was terrible, and everybody simply accepted that it was terrible. Here is why. Coffee was sold green. It came out of a sack at the grocer's, pale and hard and smelling faintly of hay, and you carried it home and roasted it yourself over the kitchen fire. And roasting coffee properly is genuinely difficult. The heat must be even. The beans must move constantly. The window between the moment the sugars finish developing and the moment the whole batch turns to charcoal is perhaps 90 seconds wide. And if you look away, or if the fire flares, or if somebody comes to the door, it is gone. So every household produced a batch that was a little scorched on one side and a little raw on the other, and different every single week. There were tens of thousands of families who never in their lives tasted a properly roasted cup of coffee. The man who fixed that was a grocer in Pittsburgh named John Arbuckle, and he fixed it with egg whites. The problem with selling coffee already roasted was that roasted coffee goes stale fast. The oils that carry all the flavor begin oxidizing within days of the roast, and in an age before airtight packaging, there was no way to stop it. Arbuckle worked out that if you coated hot roasted beans in a thin glaze of egg white and sugar, the coating sealed each bean in a shell that slowed the staling down considerably. From 1865, he sold it in 1-pound paper packets under the name Ariosa, and it went west like a wave, on cattle drives and in kitchens on the plains. Arbuckle's was what there was, and the packets became so ubiquitous that the name detached from the brand. Cowboys did not ask for coffee. They asked for Arbuckle's, whoever had made it. Then, in 1900, the Hills brothers in San Francisco began packing roasted coffee into tins with the air sucked out, and the last piece fell into place. Freshness stopped being something you produced in your own kitchen with a pan and a great deal of anxiety, and became something you bought, sealed, off a shelf. It is one of those quiet shifts that changes daily life more than most revolutions do. But there was still the matter of what happened after the grinding, and the person who solved that was not an engineer, or an inventor, or a businessman. She was a housewife in Dresden with 2 children and a specific grievance. Her name was Melita Bentz. In the early years of the 20th century, coffee at home in Germany was made either in a percolator, which boils the same coffee over and over until it tastes like tar, or in a linen bag suspended in a jug, which is a nuisance to clean and holds the flavor of everything ever brewed in it. Either way, Grounds ended up in the cup, and by the bottom of it you were drinking silt. In 1908 she went and got a brass pot, took a hammer and a nail, and punched holes in the bottom of it. Then she went to her son's satchel, took out his school exercise book, and tore out a sheet of blotting paper. She laid the blotting paper inside the perforated pot, put the ground coffee on top, set the whole thing over a cup, and poured hot water through. What came out was clean. No grounds. No bitterness from over-extraction, because the water passed through once and drained away instead of stewing. It was, essentially, the cup of filter coffee that most of the planet still drinks. On the 20th of June, 1908, she was granted protection for the design. She registered a business with capital of 73 pfennigs, and her staff consisted of her husband and her 2 young sons, who glued the boxes together at the kitchen table. She sold over 1,000 of the things at a Leipzig trade fair the following year. That company still exists. It is still owned by her descendants. It still carries her first name on every box, which means that somewhere in the world, at this moment, several million people are making their morning coffee through a piece of equipment invented by a frustrated woman in Saxony who could not stand the sludge at the bottom of her cup. While Germany was making coffee cleaner, Italy was trying to make it faster, and the Italian obsession produced the most dramatic machine in the history of the drink. The problem in an Italian cafe was queuing. Coffee brewed in a pot takes 5 minutes and serves whoever ordered 5 minutes ago. What a bar wanted was a cup on demand, one at a time, immediately. And the obvious way to speed up brewing is to force water through the grounds under pressure instead of letting gravity do the work. The first man to try it seriously was Angelo Moriondo in Turin, who patented a large steam-driven machine in 1884 and displayed it at the General Exposition there. It brewed in bulk rather than by the cup, and Moriondo never turned it into a business. A handful were built by hand. That was all. The one who made it a trade was Luigi Bezzera in Milan, who, around 1901, patented a machine that brewed a single serving at a time, through a detachable handled basket of grounds, in well under a minute. The word attached to it was espresso, which is often explained as meaning fast, but really carries the sense of expressly on purpose, for you. Bezzera was a better engineer than a salesman. And it was Desiderio Pavoni who bought the patent and put the tall brass machines with the eagles on top into bars across Italy. But there was a flaw, and every barista of that generation knew it. Those machines pushed the water through with steam. And steam is hot. Too hot. It scalded the coffee on the way past, and everything made on them carried a burnt edge underneath the flavor. It took another half-century to solve, and the answer arrived in 1948 from a Milanese bar owner named Achille Gaggia. Gaggia's idea was to stop using steam to push and use a spring instead. The barista pulled down a long lever, which compressed a heavy spring, and the spring drove a piston that forced water through the grounds at pressure far beyond anything steam could produce, using water that had never been near boiling. That is where the phrase "pulling a shot" comes from, and it is why the men working those machines developed forearms like blacksmiths, and out of that machine came something nobody had ever seen. On top of the coffee sat a thick, stable, hazelnut-colored foam, holding its shape, so dense that sugar sprinkled on it would sit there for a second before sinking. Customers assumed the bar was cheating and adding something. Gaggia, according to the story, leaned into it and advertised the machines as producing café con crema, coffee with cream. Nothing whatsoever had been added. The pressure had simply emulsified the oils and gases in the coffee itself into a foam, and that foam is now the single most photographed thing in the industry. Meanwhile, other people were working on the opposite problem: how to remove things from coffee rather than add them. In Bremen, a merchant named Ludwig Roselius, whose father had been in the coffee trade and had died young in a way the family blamed on the drink, became convinced caffeine was the culprit. Around 1903, he developed a process that steamed green beans until they swelled and then washed them with benzene to strip the caffeine out, leaving most of the flavor behind. He sold it as Kaffeehag in Germany, and in France as Sanka, a contraction of sans caféine, without caffeine. The process worked. Benzene, it turned out, is a carcinogen and is no longer used, and the modern methods use water or carbon dioxide instead. Roselius himself was an enthusiastic supporter of the Nazi Party in its early years, which is not a small footnote and should not be left out. His invention outlived his politics. And last, the invention that would go to war. Getting coffee into a powder that dissolves has a long and crowded parentage. A Japanese chemist working in Chicago, Satoru Kato, demonstrated a stable, soluble coffee at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901. An inventor named George Constant Lewis Washington, no relation to the president, produced the first commercially successful brand in 1910, and it was frankly awful. And it sold anyway. The version that stuck came from a request. Brazil. Sitting on that mountain of unsellable coffee we have just watched them burn. Approached the Swiss company Nestlé and asked whether anything at all could be done with the surplus. A chemist named Max Morgenthaler spent years on it and worked out that if you dried the coffee extract together with an equal quantity of soluble carbohydrate, the powder kept its flavor instead of tasting of cardboard. The product launched in 1938 under the name Nescafé. So within about 70 years, coffee had gone from something you burnt in a pan over your own fire to something you could buy sealed in a tin. Brew clean through a paper cone. Pull under pressure in 25 seconds. Or shake out of a jar into hot water anywhere on Earth. Every single one of those things was about to be needed. Urgently. By armies. There is a diary kept by a Union private during the American Civil War in which the word coffee appears more often than the words rifle, cannon, bullet, or mother. His is not unusual. Historians who have gone through the letters and journals of that war in bulk keep finding the same thing. Men who were fighting the bloodiest conflict in their nation's history wrote home, over and over, about a hot drink. To understand why, you have to understand what a Union soldier's day was actually like, because it was mostly not fighting. It was marching, and waiting, and being wet, and being cold, and being bored in a way that is difficult to imagine now. Battles were rare and terrible. The rest of it was endurance. And the ration that made the endurance possible was coffee. They were issued it green, which meant every man was his own roaster. He would tip the beans into a tin cup or a mess plate, hold it over the fire, shake it until the beans darkened and the smell came up, then crush them however he could, with a rock, with the butt of his rifle against a flat stone. Some units carried a spare cannonball for the purpose, and the army eventually issued a run of Sharp's carbines with a small hand grinder built into the stock, so that a cavalryman could grind his coffee with the same object he shot people with, which is one of the more honest pieces of design in military history. He drank it black, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and he drank it constantly. Before a march, after a march, in the middle of the night on picket duty, before an assault, because a hot cup was one of the few things that could be given to a man about to walk into gunfire. A general could tell how tired his column was by how often they stopped to boil. By the reckoning of the men themselves, a bag of coffee was worth more than whiskey and considerably more than a clean shirt. On the other side of the line, there was almost nothing. The Union naval blockade of the southern ports was in place from the first year of the war. And it worked. Coffee was one of the first things to disappear. So the Confederacy improvised. And the list of what Southerners roasted and ground and poured hot water over is a small tragedy in itself. Chicory. Of course. Roasted acorns. Sweet potatoes. Sliced and dried. Peanuts. Rye. Cornmeal. Okra seeds. Dandelion, ruet. Cottonseed. Newspapers printed recipes and swore the results were indistinguishable from the real thing, which tells you exactly how bad they were. Because nobody insists that hard about something that actually works. And so, along quiet stretches of the line, where the two armies sat within shouting distance of each other for weeks at a time, the men began to trade. It happened constantly and everyone knew it. A Southerner would call across and offer tobacco, which the South had and the North did not. A Northerner would offer coffee, which the North had and the South could not get for money. They would meet in the middle, sometimes on a sandbar in a river between the two camps, sometimes sending little boats made of bark across a stream with the goods loaded on them. They exchanged. They talked. Occasionally, they swapped newspapers. And then they went back to their own lines. And the next morning, when the officers said so, they shot at each other. Something in that exchange sits very oddly and very humanly. Two men who will try to kill each other tomorrow, standing in a stream today, dividing up tobacco and coffee beans because both of them want their morning to be bearable. The Union's supply held. The Confederacy's never did. And more than one historian has argued, without much exaggeration, that the North's ability to put coffee into the hands of every soldier every day was worth a battle or two on its own. 50 years later, the same pattern repeated on a much larger scale. When the United States entered the First World War, the Army's coffee purchases were so vast that they distorted the entire domestic market. The government had to step in to manage price and supply and prevent hoarding at home, because the soldiers came first. In France, coffee was what the men had at night in the trenches, not for alertness particularly, though that mattered on watch, for warmth, in a hole in the ground in Picardy in February, and for the 10 minutes it bought, in which a man could hold something hot in both hands and pretend for a moment that he was somewhere ordinary. It is from this period, according to the most repeated explanation, that the American phrase, "a cup of Joe," comes. The story runs like this. Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, was a temperance man, and in 1914 he abolished the officers' wine mess and banned alcohol on board United States warships altogether. With the wine gone, the strongest drink available to a sailor was coffee. And so, in bitter tribute, the men began calling it a cup of Josephus, then a cup of Joe. Word historians are, it must be said, extremely doubtful about this. The phrase does not appear in print until well afterwards, and Joe was already common slang for an ordinary fellow. So a cup of Joe may simply mean the common man's drink. It is a good story either way, and it has outlived every attempt to correct it. Then came the Second War, and coffee went from being a comfort to being a strategic material. At home, in the United States, coffee was rationed from November of 1942. This surprises people, because the world was not short of coffee. Brazil had more than it knew what to do with. The problem was shipping. Every cargo hull was needed for the war, and German submarines were sinking freighters coming north out of Brazil at a frightening rate. So Americans were limited to about £1 every 5 weeks, which is roughly a cup a day. And they complained about it more loudly than about almost any other restriction of the war. At the front, the answer was the powder. Instant coffee went into field rations by the million. In small foil packets, a man could tear open and stir into hot water, or into cold water if there was no fire, which there frequently was not. The United States Army bought instant coffee in quantities that essentially consumed the entire output of the industry. Nestlé's whole factory production of Nescafé in the United States went to the military. Soldiers called the powdered stuff by names that cannot be repeated in a video meant to help you sleep, and drank it anyway. A product that had launched only a few years earlier as a way of using up Brazilian surplus became, almost overnight, the drink of an army spread across 3 continents. And then, in 1945, several million men came home. They came home with a lot of things, most of them bad. One of the things they brought back was the habit. They had drunk coffee every single day for 4 years, in Normandy and North Africa, and on islands in the Pacific. And they were not about to stop now. American coffee consumption reached its all-time peak in 1946, at somewhere close to £20 per person per year. Work that out, and it comes to roughly 3 cups a day for every adult in the country. Every day, including the ones who did not drink it at all. Percolators on every stove. Folgers and Maxwell House and Chase and Sanborn on every grocery shelf. Advertised on the radio in between the cereals. And then somebody had a marketing idea that changed the shape of the working day. In 1952, an industry body called the Pan American Coffee Bureau launched an advertising campaign worth $2 million, built around a phrase that had not previously existed in the language. "Give yourself a coffee break," the advertisement said, "and get what coffee gives to you." That was it. That was the whole campaign. And it worked so completely that within a few years the coffee break was not a suggestion in a magazine. It was an expectation in every office and factory in the country. Employers put in urns. Unions began treating the break as a term of employment. By the end of the decade, American labor arbitrators were ruling on paid rest breaks as a matter of contract. And the 15 minutes in the middle of the morning had become something close to a right. Sit with that for a second. One of the basic rhythms of the modern working day, the pause that hundreds of millions of people still take somewhere around 10:30, was invented by a coffee marketing association in 1952 to sell more coffee. It worked. It is still in the schedule. And the phrase settled into the language so completely that most people now assume it is as old as work itself. So here is where we have arrived. The largest coffee market on the face of the earth. More coffee being drunk, per person, than at any point before or since. A pot on every stove and a break written into the working day. And, at exactly this moment, at the very top of the curve, the coffee in those pots began to get worse. Not suddenly. Not because of any single decision. Just a little worse every year. For about 25 years. Until an entire generation of Americans grew up believing that coffee was simply a bitter brown liquid you drank in the morning because you had to. Nobody set out to ruin American coffee. That is the first thing to understand about the next 25 years. There was no villain, no conspiracy, no single bad decision. There were simply several thousand small, sensibles, individually defensible choices, made by reasonable people trying to keep a price down. And the sum of them was a disaster. The supermarket arrived. and with it came shelf competition. And shelf competition in America was almost entirely about price. A tin of coffee sitting next to another tin of coffee is judged on the number printed on it, because you cannot smell either one through the metal. So the roasters began to trim. The first thing they trimmed was the bean, Arabica, the plant we have been following since the Ethiopian forest. Is delicate and expensive. Robusta, its coarser cousin, grows fast, resists disease, yields heavily, carries roughly twice the caffeine, and costs a fraction as much. It also tastes, at the grades used then, of burnt rubber and old grain. A little of it in a blend saves real money. So a little went in, then a little more, then rather a lot. The second thing they trimmed was the roast. Coffee loses weight in the roaster as water boils off. So a lighter roast means more pounds of finished coffee out of the same pounds of green, which means more tins on the shelf. So the roasts crept lighter and lighter, past the point where the sugars had properly developed, leaving a sour, grassy, underdeveloped flavor that nobody enjoyed and everybody got used to. Then the tin sat on the shelf, sometimes for months, quietly going stale. And then it went home to a kitchen with a percolator on the stove. And a percolator works by boiling coffee and pumping the same liquid back over the grounds again and again, which is very close to the worst thing you can do to it. Put those four together, over 25 years, and you arrive at 1970. And the cup of coffee in the average American kitchen was thin, sour, bitter and stale all at once. For the first time in the history of the country, consumption per person started falling. Young people in particular looked at what their parents drank every morning and quietly went off to buy something else. And that, of course, is precisely the moment somebody starts doing the opposite. His name was Alfred Piet, and he was Dutch. His father had been a coffee roaster in Alkmaar, so he had grown up with the smell of it in the house. He had worked in the tea trade in Java and Sumatra, which meant that, unlike almost anyone in the American industry, he had actually stood on the farms. And when he arrived in California in the 1950s and tasted what was being sold there, he was, by his own account, appalled. He is supposed to have asked how a country that rich could drink something that bad. In 1966, he opened a small shop on the corner of Vine and Walnut in Berkeley, and did everything backwards on purpose. He bought only high-grade green coffee, and paid what it cost. He roasted it himself, in small batches, very dark, in a shop-front roaster where the customers could watch. He sold it in quantities of £1 or less, so that it would be used while it was fresh. And if you asked for more, he would try to talk you out of it. And he stood behind the counter and told you where it came from, what the altitude was, and what you were about to taste, whether or not you had asked. People queued down the pavement. They still do at that corner. Among the small group of Americans who cared about coffee, he became known simply as the Dutchman. And almost every important roaster in the country over the following 30 years either learned from him or learned from somebody who had. Which brings us to three friends in Seattle. 5 years later, they were an English teacher, a history teacher, and a writer, Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Bowker. They had read about Pete, driven down to Berkeley, tasted his coffee, and come home changed. In 1971, they opened a narrow shop near Pike Place Market in Seattle and named it after the first mate in Moby Dick, because Bowker liked the sound of it. Here is the part people forget. It did not sell coffee to drink. It sold whole roasted beans by weight, and grinders, and brewing equipment. To people who intended to make their coffee at home, Pete roasted for them at the beginning and taught them how to do it themselves. And for the whole of the 1970s it stayed exactly that, a small, serious, local bean shop, run by 3 men who loved the product. Then, in 1982, they hired a salesman from New York named Howard Schultz. And in 1983, Schultz went to Milan for a housewares trade fair and walked out of the fair into the streets. And that walk is the reason there is a coffee shop on your corner. What he saw was an espresso bar, and then another one, and then 200 more, because Milan had them the way London has pubs. And what struck him was not the coffee, it was the choreography. One man behind the machine, pulling shots, steaming milk, calling out to people by name, handing cups across the counter, keeping 10 conversations and 6 drinks going simultaneously. Regulars standing at the bar for 4 minutes, drinking, talking, paying, leaving. A place that was not home and was not work, and that half the neighborhood passed through before 9 in the morning. He flew home convinced that his company was selling the wrong thing entirely. Not beans. The room. The founders said no. They said it politely and repeatedly. And their reasoning was sound. They were purists who had built a business around the bean and did not want to run a restaurant. So Schultz left, raised money, and in 1986 opened his own espresso bar in Seattle called Il Giornale, named after the Milan newspaper, with opera playing and the staff in bow ties, which was, by every account, insufferable and also extremely successful. And then, in 1987, the founders decided to sell. Schultz raised just under $4 million, bought the company he had been working for, folded his own bars into it, and kept their name rather than his own. He took the company public in 1992, and from there it went everywhere. And you know the rest, because it is probably visible from wherever you are sitting, whatever you think of what came afterwards, and there is a great deal to think. One thing is not in dispute. A country where coffee had been getting steadily worse for 25 years suddenly had a generation that expected it to be good, and was willing to pay for it, and knew the difference between one origin and another, which opened a door for people who wanted to go much further. By the late 1990s, a scattering of small roasters in America, Scandinavia and Australia had begun doing something that sounded almost eccentric at the time. They flew to the farms. They bought directly from named growers and paid well above the commodity price, on the argument that a farmer who is paid properly will pick only ripe cherries and process them carefully. They roasted lighter, not to save weight this time, but because a dark roast tastes of roast. And they wanted the coffee to taste of the place it came from. They weighed the dose to 1/10 of a gram, controlled the water temperature to the degree, and started describing what was in the cup the way wine writers describe a vineyard. In 2002, a roaster named Trish Rothgieb, writing for the Roasters Guild, gave the thing its name. She described 3 waves. The first was mass-market coffee, the tins and the powder, which had put coffee in every house on earth. The second was Peet's and Starbucks, which made it good again and made it social. And the third, which she was watching begin around her, treated coffee as an agricultural product with a place of origin, a harvest date, and a name attached. And here is where the whole story folds back on itself. Because when the third wave went out to look for the most interesting coffee on the planet, where it kept ending up was Ethiopia, Yirgacheffe, Sidamu, Guji, coffees that come out of the cup tasting of bergamot, of jasmine, of peach, of blueberry, so unlike ordinary coffee that people tasting them for the first time frequently assume something has been added. Nothing has been added. Those flavors are there because Ethiopia never did what everybody else did. It never narrowed the plant down to a handful of commercial varieties selected for yield. There are thousands of distinct heirloom types growing there, many of them unnamed. A great many still growing semi-wild in the shade of the forest canopy, exactly as they were growing when a goatherd is supposed to have noticed his animals behaving strangely. So after 1,200 years, for a continent, several empires, an enormous amount of blood and a truly staggering amount of money, the most sought-after coffee in the world turned out to be growing in the forest it had started in, more or less untouched, waiting for somebody to come back for it, which leaves only the question of what it costs, and who is paying. So let us end where we started, with the cup, and work out what is actually in it. Take these numbers slowly, because they are large. Somewhere over 2 billion cups of coffee are drunk every day on this planet. It is grown in more than 70 countries, in a narrow band around the middle of the world, wherever there is altitude and rain and no frost. Something in the region of 125 million people depend on it for their living. The overwhelming majority of the world's coffee is not grown on great estates. It is grown on small holdings, plots of a couple of hectares or less, by families who pick their own harvest and often walk it to a collection point on their backs. Coffee remains, statistically, a peasant crop that ends its journey in a luxury market. Between the family with the basket and the person paying $5 for a flat white lies one of the longest and most complicated supply chains in the food trade. And almost nobody at either end can see the other. Brazil is still first, growing around a third of everything. The plant that came in a bouquet is now a machine-harvested industry across Minas Gerais and São Paulo. Second is Vietnam, and Vietnam is the strangest story in modern coffee. The French planted it there from the middle of the 1800s. In the deep red basalt soil of the Central Highlands around Buon Ma Thuot. Then came a century of war, and by 1975 the industry was in ruins. What changed everything was policy. After the Doi Mer, reforms of 1986 opened the economy. The government backed coffee hard and planted Robusta at a pace nobody outside the country believed. Vietnam went from producing almost nothing to being the second largest coffee producer on earth in about 15 years. It flooded the world with cheap Robusta at precisely the wrong moment for everybody else. After those two come Colombia, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Honduras, and Uganda. Now, the price. Because for most of the last century, the price of coffee was not really set by supply and demand at all. It was negotiated in rooms. In 1962, the producing and consuming countries signed the International Coffee Agreement. It worked by quota. Each producing country was allotted a share of the world market, and when prices fell too low, the quotas tightened and coffee was held back. For a generation it kept the price inside a band that farmers could plan around. It is worth being honest about why the United States, the largest importer, agreed to a scheme that kept its own costs up. The answer is Cuba. After 1959, Washington was extremely keen that Latin American economies should not collapse into poverty and then into revolution. And stable coffee prices were cheap insurance, which is exactly why it did not survive the end of the Cold War. In July of 1989, the quota negotiations broke down. Brazil would not accept a smaller share. The United States, with the Soviet Union visibly failing and the strategic argument gone, saw no reason to keep paying above the market. The talks ended without agreement, and the quotas lapsed. What happened next was straightforward and terrible. Every country that had been holding coffee back released it. Vietnam's new plantations came on stream at the same time. The world was suddenly awash, and the price fell, and then kept falling for more than a decade, until in 2001 it reached around 45 cents a pound. 45 cents, below the cost of growing it almost everywhere on Earth. That period is known simply as the coffee crisis, and it did not look like a crisis from the consuming end, which is the whole problem. In Central America and East Africa, farms were abandoned. Families who had grown coffee for 3 generations walked away from the land, and a great many of them walked north, because the alternative to a farm that pays nothing is a border. And all of this happened during precisely the same years that the third wave was taking off, and cafes in wealthy cities were charging more for a single cup than they ever had. Both of those things were true at the same time, in the same decade. And holding both of them in your head at once is more or less the whole of understanding coffee. And now the plant has a problem of its own. Go back to the very beginning of this story, to the understory of that cloud forest. Arabica evolved for a narrow set of conditions: cool but never freezing, shaded, high, wet at certain times and dry at others. It is a fussy plant, and it has stayed fussy. As the world warms, the band of land that suits it moves uphill. That is fine until you reach the top of the hill, and then there is nowhere left to go. Study after study has suggested that a very large share of the land currently growing good Arabica will not be suitable by the middle of this century. The rust, meanwhile, is climbing into altitudes that used to be too cold for it, and the weather has stopped being reliable in a way that shows up directly in the market. Brazil had a severe frost in 2021, followed by drought, and the damage was not confined to that harvest. Because a coffee tree that is hurt produces badly for 2 or 3 years afterwards while it recovers. You can watch the result on a screen. Arabica futures broke their all-time record in early 2025, went past $4 a pound, and kept going through the year, more than triple where they had been in 2020. Then they became wildly unstable, falling by a third and climbing back again inside a few months, moving on drought reports and harvest forecasts and tariff announcements. The number printed on a menu board in a rich city now responds, with a lag of a few months, to how much rain fell on a hillside in Minas Gerais. So what is being done? Mostly quiet, unglamorous, patient work. There is breeding, decades of crossing Arabica with rust-resistant relatives, trying to keep the flavor while gaining the armor, which is difficult because the two qualities tend to sit on opposite sides of the family. There is the search for forgotten species. There are well over 100 wild coffee species, and the world has built its entire industry on 2 of them. One of the others is a West African plant called Stenophila, which was grown commercially in Sierra Leone in the 1800s and then vanished so completely that botanists assumed it was extinct in the wild. In 2018, researchers found it growing in 2 small patches of forest in Sierra Leone. In 2020, a panel in London tasted it blind and scored it as a specialty coffee. Blackcurrant, peach, jasmine. It reads as fine Arabica, and it grows in average temperatures around 6 degrees Celsius warmer than Arabica can tolerate. And there is the return of the trees. Shade-grown coffee, agroforestry, planting a canopy back over the rows so that the plant sits where it evolved to sit, sheltered from the worst of the sun, with birds in the branches doing something about the insects. After 400 years of clearing forests to plant coffee, a good deal of the current thinking amounts to putting the forest back. And then there is the oldest problem of all, the one that has been running through this entire story since the first terrace was cut into a Yemeni hillside. Which is the question of how much of the money reaches the hands that did the picking. Certification schemes, direct trade, cooperatives, minimum prices. Some of it works. Some of it is decoration. All of it is argued about constantly. And none of it has yet solved a gap that has been open for 4 centuries. But underneath all of it, the plant has not changed at all. It is still a shade-loving understory shrub from an Ethiopian cloud forest. It still wants a canopy above it, and rain in a particular rhythm, and a cool night. Everything difficult about coffee, from the terraces to the rust to the warming, comes from the fact that we took a forest plant and asked it to feed the world. And it has never once stopped behaving exactly like what it is. So go back to the forest. In the Kaffa and Yayu reserves, wild coffee is still growing under the canopy. Rain on broad leaves. White flowers after the rain. Red fruit months later. Nobody planted it. Nobody owns it. The monks. The terraces. The coffeehouse. The ship. The plantations. The machine. Let all of it go now. Somewhere right now. Someone is grinding beans for the morning. And somewhere else. In the dark, under old trees. The plant is doing what it has always done. Sleep well.